Hi everyone, Joshua Kirk here with you once again, and now it's time for episode 247 of Album of the Day. After a couple of weeks off, I am finally here today to talk about a British rock band that's being hailed currently as one of 2019's most adventurous and exciting rock bands working today. They're not quite an indie rock band or a punk band or a noise rock band. They're a very genre-bending, unorthodox kind of rock band, which of course I am talking about the band known as Black Midi, who formed a few years ago, but just now in 2019, but it wasn't until 2019 when they finally put out some material. They signed with Rough Trade Records and put out a couple of singles. And then on June 21st of 2019, they finally released their debut album. And the album is called Schlagenheim, which, as you can see, I have this on vinyl. I can totally see why the critics are loving this one, because this is definitely probably in my top 5 rock albums of the year so far. This is such an amazing, very forward-thinking and ambitious record that I will go into a little more detail about it, but anyway, this is one of my favorite album covers of the year, and it very much summarizes kind of the sound and the tone of the album really well. And then there's the back. There's 9 songs on this album, and it's over 44 minutes, and produced by Dan Carey. And of course, you know I love me a gatefold, and there's a really nice gatefold where you got some of the artwork, and down there are lyrics along with liner notes, and it actually lists some of the instruments that they use as overdubs on this album too, since they sort of added those on after some extensive jamming sessions from what I heard. There's side A, and then there's side B. That's the vinyl packaging for Schlagenheim, the new album by Black Midi. So, for this album, it did come out in June, but it wasn't until early July when I found out about it. And I found out that some of my favorite reviewers on the internet, including the Needle Drop, have given this a positive review, so I decided to check it out, and I cannot thank those critics enough, because I definitely have instantly fallen in love with this album, and it has grown on me the more I've listened to it, since I've listened to it at least 7 or 8 times before doing this review, because I love it that much. It's definitely the kind of record, you can try and, put this in the same sort of box as like a band like Swans or Daughters and people like that, but I think you're kind of missing the point. But if you're doing that, I think you're only missing the point and not really understanding what Black Midi is truly all about. So, I wouldn't recommend, comparing them to other experimental rock acts, although they do have some similarities. I would recommend just sort of focusing on the music of Black Midi itself, which is definitely quite cool and genre-bending and chaotic. I mean, right from the opening cut on here, 953, which kicks ass, by the way, this track opens up with this sort of hypnotic, kind of off-kilter guitar and drum crescendo before it eventually dissolves into this sort of mystical acoustic guitar and some really cool kind of vocals from frontman Garrity Greep. This song lyrically does seem kind of political, sort of judged by the lyrics, kind of talking about corruption a little bit, but these songs lyrically, they're the kind of songs that may on first listen seem incomprehensible, but as you keep listening, the message of these songs become pretty clear. There's songs about politics. There's some songs about murder. There's songs about. There's a song on here about the Flint, Michigan water crisis. The track near Detroit, Michigan, which is one of my favorite tracks here. And though the track is short, it still feels like a journey. Like it opens up as kind of this sort of squawky punk, but then it eventually turns into this more kind of somber, almost Radiohead and Rainbows inspired kind of groove with these kind of sort of subdued, but really cool kind of vocals, which in this case are done by Matt Kionzinski Kelvin. But then the song, afterwards goes into this explosion where Matt is like screaming the lyrics. There's dead, there's lead in the water, there's lead in the water. And then the band does this like crazy like two-step kind of guitar solo. I mean, it honestly baffles me the ability they're able to do that and still pull it off. Definitely one of my favorite tracks here. And back to this track, 953. I definitely do also really like this sort of I do really like the outro, how it has this kind of really sort of hypnotic groove, and then the song, like when it ends, it sounds as though it's fallen apart. It's almost kind of like some sort of giant building that's like slowly but surely, turning into just a bunch of rubble. But I think the album cover, for example, very much fits these sort of vibes really well. The next track, Speedway, is a track that this is one of the first tracks I think most people may have heard from the band, although it wasn't until this album was out when I finally got to hear this band. And good song, but I will say that this song actually isn't the best song on the album. I do think the vocals on here are kind of weak in my opinion, and even probably the groove on here, although I do like some of the extra little overdubs they add to the mix, like the wah-wah guitar and some kind of midi bongos on there too. And also, lyrically, I think the song probably isn't as strong, though I do like some of its ideas of, creating, sort of turning maybe a cute little small town and into something a bit more urban, which is kind of urban. I mean, this track could make references to urban sprawl, and I do kind of appreciate the In Rainbows inspired kind of sound of this track, given that I do love that album. And the next track, Reggae, is one that, though it may not be the best track on the album lyrically, it definitely is pretty cool musically. I really like how, even though it's called Reggae, the song is anything but a reggae song, even though there are lyrics in here about, about everything falling in line and you're gonna be okay. And I also do really like how its phrases of it may be sweet, it may be poor, it may be dark, it may be mold, pretty much sort of says that, the music could be anything, but it is anything but predictable is pretty much the subject matter of here. So essentially there is kind of satire about how Black Midi are anything but a rock band that sort of goes by classic sort of rock standards. Another track on here that I think does show that they're definitely, it shows that even with the repeating bass lines and drumming and everything, they still have an ability to get more and more intense. That would be my favorite track on here, Boom Boom Boom, which features probably my favorite bass line of the year, and also great drumming. And Garrity's vocals on here are just flat out insane. They start out as kind of in the background, sort of not really there, but then he is just going nuts, saying stuff like, it is such a purpose, What a magnificent purpose! So, as they find different ways to suck themselves off, she does not care at all. She mows with a purpose, and it only gets more and more intense and even terrifying as the song goes on, to the point where the song explodes with these sort of wailing guitars, cathartic drumming, and him just like going completely apeshit. I mean, it's just a total storm, and I absolutely love the hell out of it. So, love the hell out of it. So, definitely my favorite track here. Then this album does get rather kind of dark thematically too. I mean, the track Western is, it may not come across as particularly violent at first, but as you keep listening to it, you sort of realize how kind of murderous the song is. I mean, practicing up till noon, and then eventually taking someone's cash by the time. Eventually, the narrator taking this other person's cash once he got to Schlagenheim, which, in case you're wondering what Schlagenheim actually is, it is this music that has a variety of different notes, and although it may sort of make sense given how unpredictable Black MIDI is, the music isn't necessarily kind of the same as what you would get in Schlagenheim music. This track, I do really like the elements of alternative country and folk that the band does weave into this track. I really like the twangy guitars, the percussion's really cool, and the band also does throw in some accordion and pedal steel and banjo, some country instrumentation to sort of complete the equation. But I really like how the song starts out kind of slow and then eventually kind of feels like a little bit of a journey, and then when it hits the climax is like when the song is at its most intense and powerful. Powerful as he goes, "You were on stage, you were on stage," and that lyric at the end about it sang the chords of my memory is probably one of the saddest lyrics on the entire album. Then we have the sort of title track, which is called Of Schlagenheim, and definitely one track that has grown on me, as the song definitely is yet another one of this album's freakier and sort of crazier cuts on here. It's on here, and I really like how this song, like Western, definitely does feel like a little bit of a, not so much a song as it is kind of a journey through these stories, and also he has, and then Garrity does deliver a very sort of unpredictable vocal performance. I mean, there are points where he is sort of doing this sort of wild chant, sounding a little bit maybe like sounding like some sort of cult leader or something like that. Leader. I mean, the moment where he is just, that moment towards the end of the song where there's a moment of silence and then all of a sudden they're going nuts is like, it's total, it's like when's, it's kind of when the terror kind of, that's kind of when the terror of this album sort of starts kicking in for me. And then, and I already highlighted the track Near Detroit, Michigan as definitely one of my favorite tracks on here, for how the band, for a track that's pretty short, they do manage to create a really nice journey. They do pretty much the same with the track Years Ago, although the track stylistically is a little different. It features some very cool kind of tribal percussion along with a really catchy guitar riff. Man, and the drumming just syncopates with it all very well, as does the kind of fretless bass line. And the lyrics on here also are rather unsettling, as this is sort of inspired by a story of a rapper who sort of gained a lot of controversy and even an exodus of fans after sort of telling the truth of some pretty terrible things that he did. And I think it makes total sense that the bassist who does sing lead vocal on here, in his vocal performance, is kind of like has these kind of distorted screams going on. It definitely sounds like it's definitely kind of like that. It sort of has that little bit of that murderer in the closet kind of effect to it. But then the song does have this really beautiful midsection where things get a little more shoegazy, and we get these sort of more ethereal kind of vocals on there, which is a nice little contrast to the song's more aggressive sections. And the song actually ends in a very funny way. It kind of ends abruptly and dissolves into these like shouts that where the reverb and the echo on the shouts only gets more and more, only increases more and more as the song ends. Sort of sounds a little bit like some sort of like ship or a vehicle full of people that is just falling to the ground, and eventually the people in it end up dead and bloody in the end. In the end. And the closing track, Ducter, I think is a very strong way to close the album. It features probably some of the best lyrics on the entire LP, though not necessarily my favorite song overall on the album. This track is sort of like its opening cut, is somewhat kind of political if you think about it. I mean, some of the lyrics do sort of sound as though this scenario we're in is taking place in a courtroom a little bit. Room a little bit. And also really like the way that, and I do want to mention some of these lyrics because they are some of my favorites. I was under his scrutiny, but he failed to break me. He laid out his theories, every one that he got. He tried his best to stay strong and resilient. He does not view things as they are. He views them as they fit into his plan. He looks pathetic as he theorizes my demise. But he is pathetic and he is nothing more. And also there are some really funny lyrics. Like, I really like the line of, lyric of, diagnose if you wish, but first take your hands off your dick. That's definitely one of my favorite kind of snarky phrases on the album that Garrity sort of spits out. And also do really like the way that the guitar, bass, and drums sort of syncopate with one another is done in a very kind of frightfully is put together in a frightfully good way, and also good way. I mean, the track definitely reminds me a little bit of like Swans, like specifically their album To Be Kind, where that album was like very hypnotic and used repetition very well, as does this band. And if you're saying that just because the Black Midi uses repetition that they're boring, you're very much missing the point here. And I do really like the way that the song transitions into its very cinematic chorus that does feature a pretty entertaining vocal performance, which when they go into that chorus the second time is when that chorus especially hits pretty hard, where he goes into these like sort of crazy, sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of sounds, and at first it sounds like it wouldn't really work, but it ends up only adding to the intensity and sort of the horror that's sort of put into this album. I can't say enough nice things about this album. I mean, Schlagenheim certainly is a great experience. I mean, it's a great experience. This definitely is one of the this is definitely one rock record that, if you haven't heard it yet, definitely believe the hype on this one. Uh, the hype on this one. It's definitely a cult classic, and I hope that this album sort of ends up on enough year-end lists that people want to check it out, because it definitely is a very. This is very much the future of rock music as of right now. Like, I have a feeling. Not that I have a feeling that much rock music is gonna sound anything like this, because they're definitely very original and original, and they're, like I said, anything but predictable sort of group. I'm going with a strong 9. I'm going with a strong 8 for this new Black Midi album, Schlagenheim. Check this album out. It's awesome. And I'll see you for episode 248. What a magnificent purpose.